You know, back when I was in the academy, we would follow every toast with a song.
You know what? I shouldn't start a countdown until I've actually taken a sip, but here I am. Hi everyone. Welcome to Where No BUBS Has Gone Before, Star Trek The Next Generation podcast, hosted by myself, Jay Reckward, and my father, Jake Reckward. Of course, we're doing this for my son, Ben, but we know there's so many great Star Trek The Next Generation fans out there that we're putting all of these for free out on YouTube. How are you doing tonight, Jake?
I'm doing well, Jay. Thank you. And you?
I'm doing pretty well. Tonight's a very different episode. We've moved, I think, into a lot of different areas in the third season of The Next Generation. But the episode we're looking at tonight, which is Sins of the Father, which is season 3, episode 17, which debuted on March 19th, 1990, with a in-world star date of 43685.2 in the year 2366. This is really, I think, one of the first stories that is basically all world building and really has little to do with the science element of science fiction. In many ways, this is more, I think, the story of Sins of the Father on one hand is one half political intrigue, and then one half that we'll get into with Picard is kind of a I want to call it a noir thriller. Like, there's some very noirish things about Picard's storyline in this, but just in general, I was wondering, when it comes to Klingon storylines in terms of Worf episodes in general, what do you think of this episode, and what do you think of Klingons in general, since we're going to be digging into a lot of Klingon culture this go-around?
I think that, as we've talked before in season 3, the story writing has become much tighter. There's always, little snippets in past seasons and episodes about the Klingons and, how they're different from humans, how their culture is different. And this episode really delves into the differences in culture through, the story of how Worf was orphaned at Kittimer and what happened to him, that he has a brother, and how his father, Moog, was inappropriately, charged with treason because of political intrigue within the empire. And as you said, it'd be interesting your thoughts about Picard, because he demonstrates a great deal. A lot of honor and courage and standing up for his beliefs, very much like what happened with the episode on Data and Lal, where Picard told Admiral Haftel that, look, I'm going to take this to Starfleet because I don't agree with it. And Haftel said, well, this could cost you your career in command. He says, I understand.
Right. There's a lot of interesting things to say about Picard in this episode that we'll be touching on, but actually digging into Sins of the Father, as I said, we have a star date of 43685.2, and as part of an exchange program that we saw in Season 2 when Commander Riker went over to the Klingon cruiser, the Pa, we now have the return trip of a Klingon officer over to a Starfleet vessel, in this case, Klingon Commander Kern, played by the legendary Tony Todd, who has been temporarily assigned to the USS Enterprise D as acting first officer. So, I think it's interesting how Starfleet and the Klingon Empire are still trying to maintain this cultural exchange program. But it's not only just a cultural exchange program, it really is in some ways an officer exchange program.
Well, it's interesting, yes, that, I think allied militaries will, often, whether it's general officers or particularly just line officers, they will
Hmm.
have opportunities to get together so they can trust each other, understand their culture. So if they have to go to war together, they have a bond. And you
Right,
might recall the story one time on business. I was in Bahrain, Manama, Bahrain,
right.
and ended up having drinks with Kuwaiti and several officers of the Bahraini Defense Forces and a U.S. Army lieutenant colonel. And
Hmm.
I asked him, well, what are y'all doing here? He says, we're just talking to each other because there's, a country of concern on the other side of the Persian Gulf or the Arabian Gulf, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah. Well, I think the interesting thing about the cultural exchange program here is that there's this kind of expectation that the officers exchange are supposed to show up and actually take on the duties of an active officer with almost little to no orientation. In the and I can't remember the can actually probably look this up. Um, the IKS PA showed up in the episode A Matter of Honor. That's the episode,
Mm-hmm,
season 2,
mm-hmm.
A Matter of Honor. Um, Riker in season 2 immediately appears and is assigned to his role with the full expectation that he's going to be ready to operate on a Klingon ship, which may use an interface that features a different language than his own, featuring officers in a hierarchy that's very different from the Federation's, with their own societal norms and expectations that are seemingly foreign to him. Strangely, they also do this with Commander Kern, who beams on board and immediately takes his role and is, you know, very pointed in noting that he has studied all the technical guides and has actually prepared for this role, in a very stringent fashion, so he doesn't have to go through any sort of orientation period. Um, the thing that I found interesting about this is that even if the Klingons and the Federation are not at war with each other. They have been at war in the past. And I'm just very curious about how much technology and how much information they actually give each other in this officer exchange. Like, you need to be able to make the ship run and, understand the systems, but how much of the systems are they really divulging to each other? Like, are they giving each other full warp designs or full weapon schematics? Like, what does this relationship actually look like? I think that's one thing that I'm always curious about when it comes to these stories about officer exchanges or us trading information with each other. How much? Where's the limit that really gets drawn?
Good question. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know.
Well, one thing that Kern immediately does, as he comes aboard as his new role as the acting commander, he kind of imposes this Klingon style aboard the bridge crew, especially on
Wesley.
Wesley Crusher, who he kind of disciplines and demeans in front of the crew constantly. Um, this actually pushes Wesley at one point to approach Commander Riker and 10 forward and address Kern's aggressive command style. Um, and actually, Geordi joins in this too and notes that there's just a very different command style, and while Riker informs both of them that they're going to have to learn to adapt to it, he does take on this kind of role and understanding that I have to step away from this because of the officer exchange program, but I'm still going to go confront Kern and try to constructively offer my services, quote unquote, to help him adjust to the culture on board the station.
Hmm.
You've worked a lot in an executive role, in a leadership role, you've had to manage teams and put together teams. How do you think people should deal with aggressive coworkers or an aggressive manager, especially if they have to work in a situation where there is a job that needs to be done, and sometimes there is no choice about who you work with? Do you have any thoughts about maybe how to navigate that?
Yeah, I mean, when you have
And do you have
situations,
any reflections? I'm sorry to interrupt.
yeah,
One more
sure.
question. Do you have any reflections on how Riker handles this in this situation?
Um, First, in terms of Riker, how he handled, he really was a balancing act where he told Geordi and Wesley, like, look, you're just going to have to deal with this,
Hmm.
the personality and command presence of Kern being different. And then, the other side of the balance, he goes to Kern and, is being diplomatic, humanly diplomatic, and says, if I can offer any advice as to how you can adapt to the crew, kind of meet them halfway. And Kern just totally shoots him down. And he said, if this was a Klingon ship, I'd kill you for suggesting that.
Which isn't necessarily true because on the IKS PA, there wasn't necessarily like Klingons didn't punish each other culturally for questioning each other if it led to like some sort of success in the mission. Kern seems to be like very, very aggressive. But I'm sorry, keep going. You were saying.
But I think that in terms of when you have teams and team members don't get along, um, if the personalities are totally different and
Hmm.
there's no way you can fit them together, what I found that ultimately you have to make a decision that one of them needs to leave. And you need to
Hmm.
make a decision as to, it's unfortunate, but who's most valuable, um, who, particularly if the, the personalities just won't mix at all. You can't say it's this person's fault or that's person's fault. They
Hmm.
just don't mix. Unfortunately, I had very little um, incidents of those sort of problems, but
Well,
it's really hard.
fortunately,
Fortunate,
fortunately,
fortunately, yes.
yeah. I think um I think Kern is interesting, and I think Klingons are interesting because in some ways they address something that is antithetical to humans. Antithetical? Sure, that's the word.
Hmm.
We'll go with that. Um, you and I have talked about the human proclivity to conflict in previous episodes, but at the same time, I think humans, and I especially see this now, Ben, if you're listening, um, with other parents trying to negotiate conflict between children, that we in this modern world, and maybe we've always been this way, but as much as we are geared towards conflicting with each other, we're also kind of conflict phobic. The Klingons, on the other hand, have a culture that is the exact opposite of that. They expect conflict. In fact, they actually uphold it and physical conflict as kind of these high standards of Klingon living. Like
Well, right.
Kern wouldn't if Riker tried to kill Kern for insulting him, Kern wouldn't actually find it to be an insult
Well,
that
it's like
Riker tried to kill him.
when Riker was on the pod and
Yes.
one officer said, I don't trust you and I'm not going to follow your commands. And,
Riker
what
kicked his ass.
Riker kicks his butt. And that's how he
Yeah.
got his respect. And, and the other thing you said is that, the Klingon culture, they're the warrior culture. The best way for a warrior to die is in battle, not to grow old and just, fade away. And they are geared toward, they want to have conflict. They want to be in a battle. They
Right.
want to have a war. So, that's a very interesting point because if that's how they've been and they get into this alliance with the Federation, it's really tough for them to do.
Right. So I think for when you see characters like Kern, which again played brilliantly by Tony Todd, um, I think when you see Klingons interacting with humans, it's almost like there's this level of xenophobia that the Klingons are constantly having to work through, because I don't think intrinsically to humans I think the way Star Trek portrays humans, we're not intrinsically conflict oriented. We're more solution oriented, if that makes
Mm-hmm.
any sense.
Mm-hmm.
Where the Klingons may see the solution arise out of conflict,
Mm-hmm.
but it's not necessarily the end goal.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll get to that more. But one key scene with Kern, and this is where we finally introduce Worf really into the equation of everything, takes place at this in the captain's mess, where right after Riker confronts Kern, they head up to the captain's mess, which I think is the first time we've actually seen members of the crew eat in this area.
Mm-hmm.
Um, every ship, we've seen them eat in 10 forward, we've seen them eat in their quarters. But I don't think we've ever seen them eat here in this particular place. But it makes sense that the ship would have something like this. Just I wanted to bring up a little bit of the delicacies. There are certain, and I had to actually pull up a picture to see what was being served during this dinner. So they have everything from roasted turkey
Yes.
to cooked salmon to potatoes and vegetables. I think I see fruit on the table, and of course, Picard broke out sturgeon, or he broke out a case of caviar, which Kern, I think, humorously says it smells unpalatable.
Yes. Right.
um, You know, I think there's an interesting moment here culturally where we really do try to find common ground with our food. And we saw that in A Matter of Honor in season 2, where Riker shows up and he's
Oh,
actually very welcoming and very interested in Klingon cuisine. Where Kern is the exact opposite here. He shows absolutely no favor towards it, even making fun of, how they cook their birds, and the caviar is just unpalatable. And he finally spits out his food during dinner, where he's like, we have more flavor in our food. And I think one thing that's very good in this scene, there's this comedic little moment where like Georgie's just sitting next to him, like just cutting into his food, and he's like, well, it sits well with Worf. And it just, the entire room stops, and it's just very clear that we're finally getting to the crux of this, that Klingons look at Worf and see someone who is almost mixed race. He's almost become human in a way because he
yes.
spent so much
Right.
time in the Federation, to the point where he eats their food. Like
Which
there's
would
a real
what? How old was Worf supposed to be when he was rescued from
I
Kittimer?
think he was supposed to be like 3 or 4.
That's what I thought. 3, 4, 5, something. So he was young enough that Klingon culture and food wasn't implanted in his mind, so he could
Right.
adapt.
Right.
What you say about that is interesting because I can't remember the name of the series, but there's one with Padma Lakshmi on Netflix or
Mhm.
Prime where she really talks about American food and how, of course, she's South Asian and she experiences, you know, African American food and Southern food and German food up in Wisconsin. And she talks about how food, if you understand the food of another culture, it really
Mhm.
can bring people together. And with all of the disunity we have in this country right now, if you think about it, we've talked privately about this before. There's a real like renaissance in food culture going back
Mhm.
in the 60s with Julia Child and Justin Wilson, that Cajun chef and so on. And now, on
Well, going up
K,
into the 90s with Food Network and Bobby
yeah, oh
Flay
yes,
and
and
Iron Chef.
in all of the shows that are on Netflix and IMDb
Mhm.
and so forth about cooking, the Great British Baking Show. I mean,
Yes.
food has become such a way for people to understand one another.
Mhm. Well, it's interesting because on one thing. I think this is a fascinating thing about humans in general, and if we can go off on an aside for a moment just about food.
Hmm.
There's so many things that we judge and compartmentalize and categorize about each other, but when it comes to the sensory of taste and the enjoyment of being able to eat something new and find something delicious about it really does break down this barrier and bridge between people to where, like, I might cook chicken this one way, but you might cook chicken this way, and both ways are good, and we can both agree that that chicken is delicious. And in some ways, that weird agreement that chicken is delicious and it can be prepared your way and my way, and we both find it to be good, somehow spawns this kind of understanding between us
Hmm.
that is almost ineffable and almost unspoken, but we're talking about these things.
Hmm.
You and I have favorite beers and we have favorite moments together around food. Um, what do you think it is about food that breaks down these human barriers? Just what do you think it is philosophically or existentially? Why do you think food brings people together?
It's such a basic product related to survival and health. And if you think about um, humans 5,000, 10,000 years ago, when they were
Hmm.
perhaps the hunter gatherer stage, and they were forming small groups and so forth, and it was either pre-agriculture if they were hunter gatherers, or even as they got into agriculture, people had to collaborate together to make sure that they could have access to different foods. And people didn't understand the chemistry of it, but they had a sense of, well, we need meat, we need protein, we need vegetables, we need starch, and so forth. So I think food is it's probably an overlooked human experience because it's so important to us. It's something, and it's an activity that really just, in essence, brings people together, or
I have
has that potential.
I have a strange question for you, and it really does have to do with where we are in 2021. I live in New York. You're currently in South Carolina, but if you were to walk out, well, you're near Charlotte, but um, we are both of us are not far from great food that we can readily go and eat. Not only inside of our fridge, but just in general
Hmm.
in the world. Fast food is available. Restaurants are available even at 9:45 at night where we are. Um, do you think that the ready availability of food and kind of the disconnectedness brought by, I guess, the barrier of consumerism has done something to deaden the food's ability to bring us together?
I mean, just off the top of my head, to some degree, because I think the preparation of food is such
Mm-hmm.
a shared experience. So that what pops into my mind is, um, it's funny. Maybe it's because Mom and your Aunt Frances went to Amish country today in Pennsylvania. But I think of the stories of the Amish barn raisings where the whole
Mm-hmm.
community comes together and everybody comes and they cook this fabulous meal. They serve lunch, to all the men putting up a barn in the middle of the day, and it's such a important tribal experience. And I can think, going back to, um, you know, humans in ancient times when, finding food, growing food, providing food to whether group you're part of was so important. Again, it was when you had enough food, it was probably a shared celebration.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost like you had Thanksgiving every day.
I think it's very interesting that we live in a society that, here in the West, we still have people that starve in our society, but we have such abundance.
Hmm.
I'm very curious if the failure that we're seeing here is not like the fact that we have such abundance, but we have the inability to go out and prepare it
Hmm.
and actually include people in that preparation of it. Because I think a lot about like soup kitchens and food pantries around the city here in New York, and how like they really do draw people and try to like provide services of like a warm meal or just something that these people can take and eat with them. Um, I think my worry is that like And especially with my generation, because we really are the generation of ordering out and the Seamless and Grubhub and things like that. I tried to cook a beef Wellington for Thanksgiving, or as me and Margot like to call it, that Pilgrim conspiracy.
Mm-hmm.
The beef Wellington actually turned out well. The more I think about it, but the thing that kind of struck me is that there's a lot of people who. So I just for some background, so people know what I'm talking about. I use Gordon Ramsay's recipe that I found off of YouTube. And if you go to YouTube, Gordon Ramsay's beef Wellington video has been seen like millions and millions and millions of times. But I wonder how many people have watched that video and turned around out of those millions and millions and actually cooked a beef Wellington for themselves.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think there's a difference between watching food be prepared and watching people eat versus actually preparing the food and then eating it yourself, or even going to a place and eating it yourself. I think there might be something lost
Mm-hmm.
in kind of the food media empire that we're dealing with now.
I think that consumption of food together is a really important experience. I mean, just
Mm-hmm.
having dinner with Michelle and her family tonight. But if you consume the food, but prior participate as a group in preparing it, it just deepens the experience.
Well, I think back to that scene last season, in season two, where Riker invites everyone over so he can make them eggs.
Oh
And
yes,
even though those eggs are awful, well, Worf likes them. So
yes.
something did sit well with Worf's Klingon digestion. But, even though those eggs were not good, it's a shared experience that even you and I, as viewers, still remember. Because, there was something that we saw the crew take part in. But getting back to the story, this incident at the meal between Worf and Kern leads Worf to confront Kern in his guest quarters, where it's finally revealed that Commander Kern is in fact uh, Kern, the son of Moog, and Worf's brother, who has come in search of his elder sibling to defend the honor of their house in front of the High Council because their father Moog has been accused of treason during the Kittimer massacres. Um, so before we jump really into the main crux of this story, and we've gone 26 minutes so far,
Oh, and
kind
just one comment to make. I think that Kern's um, expression of severe Klingon discipline, and at one point he says some things, or just in front of Worf, he kind of leads up to the conversation they have in his guest quarters. Oh, actually, I think it's Worf's quarters that Kern goes to.
no, they go to Kern's
All right.
guest quarters.
Okay, that's right. Because they talk about it's too comfortable and that sort of thing. And
Yeah.
Kern really presses Worf as to, are you really Klingon? And Worf
Yes.
goes back, I am a Klingon. And they get into a physical fight. And then Kern backs off and said, it's like his whole purpose was to get Worf to the point that he would fight back and not accept, not wimp out. And Kern says, you are a Klingon. And
That
then,
is the response of a Klingon. The
right,
response I would expect from my older brother.
right. And that's when he reveals. And then there's actually a commercial break where there's this shocked look on Kern's
It's
Worf's
actually
face. Yeah. And
yeah.
then they come back for the commercial and the story continues from there.
So let's talk about that commercial break because you brought it up and I completely forgot about it. Um, isn't it interesting how we view these episodes in 2021 in a streaming format versus how we probably had to wait
Mm-hmm.
3 to 5 minutes in the past to
Mm-hmm.
see where Worf shock would pay off.
Mm-hmm.
I think by today's standards, these kind of scenes that suddenly fade out to black because that's when you would go to the commercial. They're very interesting artifacts of like old television at this
Actually,
point.
mention it when they have to in a streaming story now. Those change of venue, change of scene are very different from how they were
Mm-hmm.
they weren't designed with a commercial necessarily in mind. So they're very different from what they were in older television.
Right.
That's a good
Well,
point.
you and I say older television, but it's now older to both of us because we
Yes.
can both see this kind of
Right.
change.
Right.
But when we come back, Worf is revealing, and I really want to uh, ex- really want to get this correct. So, Kern explains to Worf that he was barely a year old when their family went to Kittimer, and they weren't going to stay there for long. So he was left with Moog's friend Lorg on the Klingon homeworld of Kronos, with the hopes of reuniting upon their return. However, during the Kittimer massacre, Worf was rescued by a Klingon was rescued by a Starfleet officer and was told by the Klingon High Command that Worf had no living relatives.
Right.
So Lorg effectively adopts Kern. Um, when Kern reached the age of ascension, however, Lorg told Kern the origins of his bloodline being of the House of Moog. Kern has sought Worf out because their father, Moog, is accused of treason by the Klingon High Council. Supposedly, he had given the Romulans defense access codes allowing them to lower the shields of the Kittimer outpost just before a Romulan attack. Kern has lived all these years hiding his identity by masquerading as the son of Lorg, but when he learned of the Council's actions, he has now come to Worf, asking him to challenge the judgment as Moog's eldest son. Um, so this leads to a scene where Worf goes to Picard and explains this to him, asking for leave so he can face the High Council. And I think that this is where the two main storylines start. We have one with Worf that's political intrigue, and I think this is one where we also have Jean-Luc Picard enter kind of a noir detective hero role in a way. But there is a I think beautiful line here that I kind of wanted to reflect upon and then us discuss. So Worf asks, "Will you grant my leave, Captain?" No. If I understand correctly, a Starfleet officer or respected member of my crew could be charged with a capital crime. Your actions on this matter will reflect on this ship and on the Federation. Therefore, it seems only appropriate that your captain should be at your side while you make your challenge. I'm sure you would do no less for me. And then Picard literally orders the Enterprise to Kronos in Klingon territory.
Hmm.
Um, what do you think of the stakes here? Worf is now part of a situation where he could be put to death over his father's supposed crime, and Picard, in this rather cavalier and heroic moment, is rallying to Worf's side, sending the Enterprise headlong into the Klingon Empire. I think that this is a great scene because, it really builds up on this kind of tension we now know is existing in the episode for Worf, but it also gives us kind of rallying moment too. Just any reflections on the scene and
Yeah,
what do you think?
I think it's a very good principle of leadership that I've always believed in and try to exercise is that if you're a leader and you have people reporting to you, then they need to be loyal to you.
Mm-hmm.
Um, as long as you're following the rules and all that sort of thing. At the same time, it's sort of like a social compact that
Mm-hmm.
you have to be supportive back to them. And
Mm-hmm.
I think if a leader really can communicate to his followers, his employees, his crew, his crew, that he's there for them,
Mm-hmm.
then the relationship goes both ways. And there's, certain established rules and mores as to how that would work. And I think this is where Picard demonstrates that. And, there's such a closeness that's developed among the bridge staff and so forth
Mm-hmm.
that they really are family in a sense.
Right.
And Picard is somewhat of a father figure anyway,
Mm-hmm.
being not married and having no children of his own. So, I think you're right. It's a very important scene just in terms of what kind of person, what kind of leader Picard is, what kind of friend Picard is.
Right. Well, it also establishes that, Worf again is this character trapped between two worlds. He is a
Hmm.
Starfleet officer,
Hmm.
and we'll get into that here in a second, but he also is bound by this, you know, it's easy for us to say as humans that I'm bound by this tradition or bound by that tradition, but genetically, he feels like he is culturally bound by Klingon tradition.
Hmm.
Um, One thing that I find interesting about this is that as soon as Worf is made aware that he has to go and defend his father in his house's name, he's immediately swept into the possibility that he is going to be put to death for this. I am surprised that there is no intergalactic court apparatus or some sort of legal apparatus in place to, I don't know, you wouldn't think that there would be a Starfleet lawyer someplace or a Starfleet JAG officer who would go like, wait a second, we aren't sending an officer to get executed by the Klingon Empire. Like, he needs some representation. We need to talk to an embassy. Like, this is crazy. You're all crazy.
Well,
Like,
this is,
let's stop killing each other for a second and talk this out.
between Kern and Worf, they just keep this. They don't make it a Federation issue. I mean, it becomes an Enterprise issue because of Picard's action, but they very much kind of keep it up, within Klingon tradition and Klingon law.
Okay, so let's talk about what the actual conceit is here, and we'll give away what the storyline is, just so we can talk about
Yeah,
the other things in general.
right.
So essentially, what happens is that there's this House of Duras, and they have been working with the Romulans to further their power in the Empire. And one of their moves was to betray the Empire by giving the Romulans the defense codes to the Khmer outpost and framing Worf's father, Moog.
Hmm.
We later discover that. Through Picard's investigation, which we'll talk about here in a bit. But one of the things that I think comes out of it that is very interesting is there is this sense that I want to frame this correctly. There is this sense that um, if this information that the House of Duras actually betrayed the Empire to the Romulans, Kimpek, the Chancellor of the High Council, who's essentially the head of government, is worried that this will lead to civil war. I'm bringing all of this up because getting back to Picard and just the crew's interaction in this story, you would think that Picard would want to warn Starfleet the moment he realizes, hey, the Romulans are trying to conspire with forces within the Klingon Empire to, take over the High Council, and these Romulans want to constantly go to war with us over the neutral zone, and we don't like the idea of them just working with Klingons to, you know, destabilize our allies. Who, the
Yeah, there's
the
there's there's a potential for a civil war. Yeah.
Right. So, and the Federation does benefit from the Klingons maintaining a certain status quo and not going to war with each other.
Hmm.
Because there's an understanding that if the Klingons go to war with each other, they're also going to go to war with anyone else. Like there's going to
Hmm.
be raids on Federation outposts.
Chaos, right? Yeah.
Yeah. It just surprises me that Picard along the way wouldn't stop going like, "Hey Worf, we're going to take care of this, but let me call headquarters too because this seems like something that could be, intergalactically bad."
This
Um
is this is a very good point you're making, but I think that they just kind of ignored that to make the story.
right.
Yes,
Well,
exactly.
it's the conceit of storytelling, but
Yes,
I
exactly.
think
Yeah,
that
it's a
it
good
was
point.
it was just one thing when I saw them ripping off to
Hmm.
Kronos,
Hmm.
because they do have that scene where they turn the ship
Hmm.
around.
Hmm.
I was just sitting there like, wait, we're not going to call anyone to Starfleet HQ and be like, hey, we're heading to Kronos. You know how we were supposed to study this cometary belt?
Hmm.
We're dropping all that.
Hmm.
Never mind. Um, But when they get to Kronos, it's very clear that there is a high level of corruption within the Klingon Empire, especially when it comes to Kempek, who is this kind of aged, fat Klingon warrior who is sitting on this throne surrounded by these different, almost feudal houses.
Right.
And when it finally comes out that it is Duras who betrayed the Empire and not Moog, it is assumed that Worf um, wasn't going to show up because he was in Starfleet to defend the house, and that Kern would be put to death, and that this matter would just be swept under the rug. Worf's arrival destabilizes all of these assumptions and basically throws them out the window, and we slowly, over the episode, pick apart what's actually going on in terms of the nature of Duras and their relationship to the Romulans, but also kind of what is revealed in this is that there's a real societal rot happening within the Klingon Empire, and it's not societal as much as it is cultural. And I think that's where we're really going to get into tonight's discussion.
Is it cultural or political, or a little bit of
I
both?
think it's all together.
Yeah, right.
I think when we talk about society and culture, I'm sorry. I think when we talk about culture and politics, I think that all kind of falls under
Okay.
society.
There's one point you might want to bring up now that's important because
Yes.
just to review that, Worf has to have a second in case he
Mm-hmm.
has to get into combat, and initially he asks Kern to be his Chadish, and
Mm-hmm.
something happens so that Kern can't fulfill that role. So then Worf asks Picard to be his Chadish, and Picard
Mm-hmm.
says yes. So when they go back from
Well, before
yeah,
before Picard says yes, it's good that you brought up the scene because I wanted to actually talk to you about this, and I wanted to talk to this in larger extent. But um, Picard says, there are younger and stronger men among the crew for you to choose, and I actually want to use Worf's. It may not be here. So sometimes they don't have these. Uh,
as you're looking that up, the thing I wanted to say,
Never mind.
you made a
Yeah,
comment
go
about
ahead. Go
how
ahead. Sorry.
when Worf comes back and engages with the council, that's almost not expected because he's a Starfleet officer, so he has an out. So he kind of he throws the council off guard a little bit, and then when the story progresses, so that Picard becomes his Chadish and he comes back with a human in that role, it throws the council off even more.
Well, it leads to this very interesting interplay between Picard and Duras, where Duras says, "This is not your world, human. You do not command here." "I am not here to command," says Picard. "Then you must be ready to fight, something Starfleet does not teach you. You may test that assumption at your convenience," Picard warns Duras. Um, Kind of stepping back for a second, Picard is surprised that Worf asks him to take on this kind of warrior guardian role because he assumes that people will look at him as being either too old or too infirm. But
Mhm.
Worf doesn't assume that. He assumes because of Picard's character, he is the exact right person to stand as his second in these proceedings. What do you think that says about Klingon culture when it comes to how they appraise a person versus maybe how Picard appraises himself and maybe how we appraise ourselves in I think it's very clear to say that and you can speak to this and I can speak to it a little bit being 35 and dealing with these young folks now. Um, what do you think of that kind of ageism that Picard places on himself?
Um, well, I just turned 69, and I'm kind of experiencing this because um, it kind of relates to an email that you saw today that um, regardless of your age, one has to try to have a realistic understanding of what their strengths, weaknesses, capabilities are.
Mm-hmm.
And but at sometimes it's difficult for you to have that internal reflective perspective of where you are. So
Mm-hmm.
you need somebody to recognize this. And I think the key thing is not physical strength. Part of it's intelligence, but it's the strength of character.
Mm-hmm.
That's the thing that Worf really sees in Picard and understands about Picard in terms of I'm going to ask him to do this because I know he will see it through to the end.
Yes. Well, I think that is one thing about Klingon culture, at least Klingons like Worf, that I think are of high value that this society needs more of. I
Yes.
mean, I think that we really do need to appraise each other less on, you know, not our appearance and maybe our physical ability, but the actual content of what we bring beyond that.
I think where this needs to start is within the effing United States Congress.
Well, absolutely, but that's a
We'll
different.
just leave that aside. Right.
Yeah, but so as Tradich, and we'll talk about Picard here before we get back to Worf. This is an interesting role for Jean-Luc Picard because in some ways he takes on the investigation of what happens to Worf onto his on as his own responsibility. He almost becomes Dixon Hill in a way where
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
he's skulking off into the shadowy alleys of Kronos looking for Kalis, which is
Mm-hmm.
Worf's old nursemaid,
Mm-hmm.
who was actually at the Kittimer outpost and was rescued by the Starfleet officer. And I think it's assumed that Kalis gave Worf up to the Starfleet officer, which is very interesting to me because it's like, well, wait, you know that he had a brother and you know that this is the son of Moog and you know he didn't betray anyone, so why'd you give this baby up? But anyway, it leads to this really interesting scene with where just like Kern had to face off against two Klingons sent against Duras, Picard actually shows that he's not old and he does have this physical prowess and his ability to fight back against the Klingons
Mm-hmm.
in almost a very well, not a, almost a very vicious knife fight where he actually stabs one of them in the stomach.
And I
Um,
and I think that the result is that ultimately
Kalis actually saves him.
Picard would have been overpowered, and Kalis, who at first said, "I'm not going to get involved in this," is
Right.
probably once she sees how committed Picard is in his role as Chadish, and he's having this death struggle with these two Klingons. She comes back, and what does she do? Like, she's stabbing.
She throws a knife into the
That's
Klingons's
right.
back.
Yeah.
Well, like she even says, "You're very brave, Chadich." And I
Yes.
think that says something interesting about like Klingon culture in general. Um, one of the things that happened when they tried to assassinate Kern, they rescue Kern and they bring him back to the Enterprise sick
Right.
bay where Beverly Crusher's like, how can anyone use a weapon that would create such a hard wound? And Worf goes, well, it's the ceremonial weapon of an assassin, which means they actually have a culture that actually celebrates and permits assassinations, which we've seen in the IKS PA before during Matter of Honor, where they said, if you feel like your captain is out of line, the second in command is expected to stand up and kill him and take his command.
Right.
I find I think the interesting thing I find about this scene where the Tradich fights off the two Klingons and Kalis values Picard as a brave man is that maybe there's not an expectation in Klingon culture that when you get into a fight you're actually supposed to win, but you're supposed to be bravely face death. And
Mm-hmm.
and I think that's something that may get lost sometimes by the fans and maybe by Western society in general. We really do placate kind of our glory on victory, but there is something to be said about having the courage and bravery just to see to see death through or the possibility of death through. And I
Mm-hmm.
was just wondering, like, what did you think about the action in the scene, and then what do you have any comments or commentary to add to anything that I've said?
Yeah, I think that it goes back to the Klingons being a warrior society. It's their desire, goal to die with honor in death. And it's not a matter, as you say, whether they win or lose. It's the matter of them give, doing the good fight with honor.
Yeah. Well,
It makes
it's
me think of something where, the 2019 movie Midway,
hmm
where, one of the initial attacks of the American planes from Midway Island on the Japanese fleet, it's Admiral Yamaguchi, uh, you know, and actually this has happened in the Midway, the 1976, I think it was Midway with Charlton Heston and Henry Fonda, is that the Japanese really respected the bravery that
hmm
the American pilots demonstrated, not just from the Midway group, but from the American carrier groups, because many of those planes when they attacked, whether they were torpedo planes or the dive bombers, these guys knew they were going to their death, and
hmm
the Japanese didn't expect that of the Americans. And
yeah.
they once they realized who they were fighting, they actually respected them. So again, it comes back to the going back to the Klingon culture. It's how you behave as a warrior with honor.
It's
And
it's interesting that you bring that up because one of the things about Klingon culture that underpins its writing was a study of Japanese samurai culture.
well, it's I just thinking about through it. It's samurai and bushido.
Yes. Well, it's very interesting that we bring that up because it's going in a different direction than I thought we would be going. But once Picard figures out, and with the help of the crew, to figure out that it was actually the House of Duras that betrayed the Empire to the Romulans and caused the Kittimer outpost raid. Worf and Picard brings the information before the council, and they are quickly taken behind to a closed room with Kimpek, and of course Kalis is brought forward, and Kimpek basically dismisses her because it's already known by Kimpek that, like, of course the House of Moog did not destroy um or did not betray the Empire to the Romulans. Of course we know it's the House of Duras. And there's this kind of expectation. I want to read I think I have the quote right here. Um, Basically, Kim Peck tells Worf, "Look, if you had stayed out of this, you would have been able to just walk away from all this. You would have been a Starfleet officer. You have continued a sterling career." And there's even a point early on in the episode when Worf first talks to Kim Peck where it's very clear that Kimpek is actually familiar with who Worf is, and actually holds him in some esteem. Like there's an understanding I think Kimpek has that Worf does have some importance to me because he's a Klingon officer in the Federation. He helps me maintain some sort of relationship with this um outside organization that is not our culture. Essentially, Worf is that bridge, and I think Kimpek realizes that.
Mhm.
At the same time, he's willing to sacrifice that bridge to maintain the status quo of the Klingon Empire. And this kind of mimics a lot of the things that we saw from the Tokugawa shogunate
Comment.
and the
Comment. Is it Ken Peck who was willing to sacrifice, or Ken Peck is willing to sacrifice Worf, or is that Worf is willing to sacrifice himself?
we'll
Just
get there.
clarify that point. Okay, go
We'll
ahead.
get there.
Okay.
So to clarify that point, um, yes, Kimpek is willing to sacrifice Worf. We will get to Worf in a moment.
Okay. Sure.
Um,
Fine.
One of the big fan theories about and it's not really a fan theory because Ezri Dax kind of mentions it at the end of Deep Space Nine in a conversation with Worf, but the Klingons are a culture in decline. because in many ways they are trying to maintain this kind of aristocratic warrior society, but it's very clear that they have a feudal system that is just falling down around them. The Chancellor, who is not the Emperor, is trying to keep together this rabble of houses, some of them that are actively working against the Empire to further their own ends. And he is not only allowing it to happen, he's actually covering for traitors against his own people. For a warrior society, and I think Picard says this well, when it's finally revealed that, everyone knows the truth, Picard goes at Kempek very hard, and he says it here. You admit the truth, and yet you expect him being Worf, to accept punishment. What does this say of an empire that holds honor so dear? The empire will not be destroyed for one family's honor. You're unacceptable, Kempek. You have no say in this, Chadich. I speak now as the captain of the USS Enterprise and Lieutenant Worf's commanding officer. You will not execute a member of my crew, nor will I turn his brother over to you. This is not the Federation, Picard. If you defy an order of the High Council, the alliance with the Federation could fall to dust. The alliance with the Federation is not based on lies, Kempek replies Picard. Protect your secrets if you must, but you will not sacrifice these men. So, Kempek is willing to throw away the alliance with the Federation over this secret. What do you think it says about the Klingon Empire that they are in such a state that one secret can bring them to the brink of civil war?
Well, I think it fits in with what you said, is that when, if they're truly in that position, it seems they are. It's, it's not, everything's not, the empire's not based on a house of cards, but it's based on a house of lies. And it's
Right.
not honorable. And that's a good definition of how the rot is.
So, I don't want to bring politics into this too much, but I think it's a good conversation to have in 2021. Worf knowingly decides to accept discommodation, which is basically the banishment from the Klingon Empire and the dishonorment of his house. Essentially accepting that his father is the traitor, but taking the punishment of his father onto himself in exchange for his brother Kern being spared and continuing to remain the son of Lorg instead of the son of Moog. There is this constant need, it seems, in society at some point to maintain the status quo against the fear of chaos and civil war. In 2021, there's a constant media narrative here in America that we could be possibly headed towards civil war because of our cultural and societal differences here in America. You mentioned House of Cards, which is another TV show that was on Netflix that kind of showed how the American government is built on a house of cards, manipulated by all these political players, starring Frank Underwood, played by the infamous Kevin Spacey,
Yes.
who's, now truly disreputable and a dishonorable individual because of his sexual assaults of young men. We should mention the villains, folks. Do you think that at the same time, you and I have talked many times in previous episodes about how the U.S. government has either misinformed, disinformed, or withheld information from the American public. I have 3 questions to ask you. Well, 2, really. Do you feel like America is either a house of lies or a house of cards? And to follow that question, do you worry about civil war?
The answer to both of them, unfortunately, at this point, is yes, because specifically for number one, I think the principles of rule of law, which implies fair play, fairness in general, are being ignored right now, and the so much of the narrative as to what the societal and cultural shifts are, particularly from the right, are based on disinformation, misinformation, and outright lies that, not as we've discussed, not that the left has issues or maybe, I use the term loosely, but incorrect thinking, bad policy.
Oh, I would say that they would lie as much as the right does in some instances.
Yes. So if you've got that sort of, if people aren't dealing honestly with one another, example today, now they came to a Senate yesterday, the House first, and then the Senate decided to raise the debt ceiling issue. They kicked the can down the road to February 18th. Why can't they just deal with this? They don't want to shut down the government, particularly with, we're still trying to recover from the economic stresses of the pandemic and so forth, the impact it would have on, American business and the stock market and individuals. It's just, it's insidious.
No, so I can there's three things I can tell you about this, and we may have talked about this in a previous episode, but the first one is all of them, both sides, left and right, doesn't matter if it's Democrat or Republican in the Senate or the House, none of them are willing or brave enough to touch non-discretionary military spending. We spend over $750 year on year, nearly $750 billion year on year, war or no war. And yet, we're not even having a conversation about what we can cut from that non-discretionary budget and redistribute to places that desperately need it in American society, because we're not at war anymore, according to Joe Biden in the news. So, we should be using that $750 billion to help pay for schools, pay for food, make sure that people can stay in their houses. The second thing, however, I think, is that the debt ceiling is such an artificial conversation in the first place. Because for those at home that,
Yes.
and I know we're getting away from the episode, but this is usually the time we get away from the episode. The debt ceiling itself is such an artificial conversation because we act like it is something that is germane and consigned to just the US, but it involves so many international partners, both in terms of sovereign governments, but also in terms of non-governmental organizations, including banks and multinational corporations that hold large parts of government debt as part of a sharing program to mitigate risks, which we do all the time in the market, folks. Just like we mitigate risk by sharing debt on the level, like we also do. Anyway, you were about to say something.
It's like financial insurance.
Essentially, yes. But it's such an artificial thing because, who's going to call in our debt? Whose debt are we going to call in? That's never going to happen, but I think it keeps getting used by Republicans to point to, this overburdened budget that they overburdened by starting the Iraq and Afghanistan crises. I won't say starting, but yeah, do you know what? Fuck it. They decided to pull the trigger on those wars. They know what they did. But the third thing that I think that really gets me about the debt ceiling conversation is that it always covers up other things that can be talked about. Instead of like you said, why don't they deal with this? Because the truth is, if they were to actually deal with the business of the people, they couldn't have excuses to have debt ceiling discussions. They wouldn't be able to get there in the first place. it's weird. Like, just like the Klingon High Council doesn't want to do their job and defend the honor of one family, which matters in a system of justice, our Democrats and Republicans don't want to
Well,
defend the actual solvency of the American people.
well, to get us back on track, I think you hit a very important thing is that they're not doing the work and will of the American people. And they're concerned with their own political power and positioning and so forth, and the groups they represent. And it goes
Yes.
right back to the episode, is that you've got this empire that at the upper levels of its semi-feudal tribal government, you have these families jockeying for a position with one another, and one particularly powerful family is corrupted because of their relationship with the Romulan Empire, a enemy of the Klingon
Well,
Empire.
can I frame like what the bigger, larger problem with this is?
Go ahead.
So, the Federation, because of the Khmer Accords, is at peace with the Klingon Empire. However, they are not at peace with the Romulan Empire. It's very clear because of the neutral zone, the Federation and the Romulan Empire, especially in Star Trek Next Generation, are always on the potential brink of war. So the Romulans are clearly using the Duras family to try to place the Duras in a politically advantageous position so they can somehow sway Klingon policy, potentially against the Federation.
Sure. Yeah.
And we know from previous episodes, there are still Klingons who think that they shouldn't be allied with the Federation, that they should be raiders and reavers, and, they
Right.
should build the Empire off of blood and bones and blades.
Yes.
Um, there is something greater at play here where it's almost, we talk about Russia, and I think that we don't really take the time to respect Vladimir Putin for the real threat that he poses, and the fact that this guy goes all in. Like the Romulans, they go all in. They will make people betray other people with not even the promise of wealth or escape, but with power. There's a longer game being played here, where it's not like the idea of like, oh, we don't have to kill Kim Peck, we can just replace him over time. And it's this kind of long game that I think that we here in the West, and especially here in America, don't really appreciate from
And
our
China
enemies.
China plays that game even better than the Russians.
I would. Do you know what I have? I agree with you on some level. I disagree with you on others. I think Russia plays a very good game when it comes to diplomatic relations and economics. I think China's kicking our ass in terms of cyber warfare, and especially in terms of weapons development now with their
Hmm.
supersonic missile. Like they even worried the Russians with their deployment of it.
Hmm. Hmm.
But I think in general, one thing that always kind of is at the back of the Klingon Empire is that there's always this worry that somehow the truth is going to set these people against each other. And in this case, the truth is going to cost one family their honor. For the sake of peace, we just have to sacrifice the House of Moog. Do you think that, and this is, I'm going to end it with this. And this is a really moral and ethical question for you, Dad. And I struggle with this one too. And I think everyone who thinks about these things at some point struggle about it, especially if you really care about your democracy.
Hmm.
Um, and I think both of you and I care very much. And I hope, Ben, when you listen to this later on in your years, you still have a democracy to care for. Um, God, I think you will. I don't think we automatically end in civil war, but I do think we end up with a very different democracy.
Hmm.
If the system takes, if the cost of maintaining the system is the honor of one family, the truth that one family is innocent, is that system worth keeping?
Yes and no. On the
Yeah.
surface, no. On the other hand, yes, and that gets into the story and getting back to the practical aspects of what the writers may have thought long term is that
Well,
when
they have to tell more stories down the road about
yeah,
this.
and this episode sets those other stories up a lot.
It's
And
actually the
when
first in a 6-part arc. If
I
they're
yeah,
yeah.
I knew that it was It's good that you said there's 6 future parts to this arc, but I think when Worf comes up with the idea of discommendation, and Kempek goes,
Mm.
he understands immediately that it diffuses the current situation. Now
Mm-hmm.
that's okay, but it's still, again, as you said, the empire is being held together based on protecting the lies of one family, the treason of one family. But what it opens up, separate from future episodes that the writers can construct, if you put yourself into this world, what Worf has done, it kind of like, I'm not going to get executed, so I'm going to live to fight another day,
Right.
and I'll come at this another way. I'm not going to give up in restoring honor to the House of Moog.
Well, it's beautiful because in some ways this is the hero starting their arc.
Yes,
And as we
exactly.
find out later on through multiple shows, Worf plays a huge part in
Hmm.
determining the future of the Klingon Empire, and this is
Hmm.
really the beginning of it. And
Hmm.
it's almost classic in a way where the hero is stripped of almost everything and has to
Hmm.
go and rediscover themselves now, and we're
Hmm.
going to see that.
Hmm.
Um, I think that you had a very good answer to that question. I think when it comes to the real difficulty of governance and rule, and even and I say rule even though I'm a fervent defender of democracy, at some point you still have to make a decision that will supplant the will of a certain group of people and will
Hmm.
upset people. It
Hmm.
just happens.
Hmm.
And it's part of leadership, which what we've been talking about tonight. Someone has to lose out at some point on a
Hmm.
decision.
Yeah,
I,
that's good. That's a good point because it really does put um, Worf is exercising a very leadership-based decision here.
right. Well, like, on one hand, I think one thing that we often forget, and the show says Civil War. And I think when we say Civil War, we kind of think of, the American Civil War between the North and the South, and we think of Gettysburg and Lincoln, and we think of all these movies. But I think what we often forget when we talk about these things, especially in narrative, these are lives. What Worf is choosing, ultimately, is to spare Klingon lives. I think what Kempek is ultimately trying to do is not only keep his power, but spare Klingon lives. I think Duras is just, trying to consolidate his power, but he doesn't want to lose his life either. Kind of getting back to, like, the strangeness and maybe the cultural decay of the Klingon Empire, you have all these warriors who are saying war, 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 war. We're this culture of war, but when it comes to actually fighting over honor and the truth, and having the courage like Kalis did to see the world as it is, or see the galaxy as it is, they're all trying to avoid a fight. I think it's just a very interesting dynamic that we
Hmm.
see here.
Hmm.
Well,
Yes,
Dad, I think tonight has been a really great episode. I thank
yes.
you for joining me. Do you have
Sure.
any parting thoughts on Sins of the Father?
No, I just think it again. As you said, it sets up a arc, maybe another 6 episodes that continues this story line.
Right. I think just in general, this is a really gorgeous
Hmm.
produced episode. One thing that I do want to highlight before we go, there are some really striking visuals throughout this episode that's just kind of peppered in there. There's one where Worf is going to get receive discommendation, and Kern is trying to talk to Picard and say, why is he doing this? Why is he doing this? And like, there's this just striking image of Picard's kind of like bruised face from the fight, and it's very much showing him, or at the shoulder of Worf. He really has become like this warrior Chadich, but
Mhm.
just beautiful scenery, beautiful imagery. I like Kim Peck because Kim Peck looks like a fat gangster,
Mhm.
and he even comes across a little bit like Marlon Brando's character in The Godfather when he's older and more rotund.
Mhm.
Um, but other than that, just great episode. Don't you agree?
Yes, I do. It was very good. Yeah.
Well, Dad, thank you so much for joining me. We will be back next time for Star Trek: The Next Generation Season 3, Episode 18, Allegiance. We'll see you then.
Okay. Thanks, Jay. Good night.
Night.